The old inn seemed to breathe in the mist that rolled from the marshes, sighing through its warped windows and cracked doors, as if the house itself remembered something dreadful. The guests had gathered not out of belief, but curiosity, drawn by whispered stories of a threshold that separated the living from the forgotten. They laughed quietly at first, their voices thin against the wet air, unaware that sound itself carried strangely here, bending, echoing, returning. Candles trembled without wind. The floorboards clicked as though counting down. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed, though none had opened it. What began as a retreat soon felt like a séance conducted by the house itself. Its walls listening, its silence responding. Every shadow seemed deliberate, every reflection an intrusion. They had not come to witness spirits, they had come to be witnessed by them. By morning, no one spoke of the unease that had crept between them like a chill. They gathered for tea as though the night's distortions were dreams misremembered, but the inn had changed subtly. The air felt denser, the silence almost intimate. A soft humming came from within the walls, pulsing faintly like a memory replaying itself. When they tried to locate the sound, it vanished, only to resume when they looked away. The host smiled too easily, as though rehearsed. In the hallway, a mirror leaned at an angle that reflected nothing of those who passed before it. Behind the scent of old wood and damp linen, something else lingered, the faint aroma of burned paper, of offerings once made to things unseen. The retreat was meant to confront fear. Instead, it seemed to summon it. As dusk returned, the marsh began to glow faintly under a shroud of silver mist. The host led them outside for the evening's cleansing ritual, a ceremony meant to honor the unseen. The group formed a ring beside the stagnant water, holding candles that guttered, though the air was still. A single bell tone resonated, deep and trembling, and in that vibration each felt a heaviness behind the eyes, a pressure, as if the darkness were studying them. The reflection on the water did not match their circle. There was one figure too many, motionless, standing between two others who had not noticed. Ripples spread without cause. No one spoke. When the bell rang again, the candles extinguished at once, leaving them in the sound of their own breath and the distant whisper of something vast exhaling beneath the marsh. They returned to the inn in silence, footsteps echoing off the damp floorboards. The scent of the marsh clung to their clothes, and the house seemed to greet them with a deeper darkness. In the common room, the hearth burned with unnatural intensity, the flames rising too high, bending toward the guests, as if drawn by their unease. Somewhere above, faint knocking began. Steady, rhythmic, patient. The host excused himself, vanishing down a corridor that seemed longer than before. The knocking grew louder, closer, then abruptly ceased. When he returned, his sleeves were wet, his eyes unfocused. "It's begun," he murmured, though no one dared ask what he meant. The inn creaked, its timbers expanding like lungs inhaling something unseen. That night, no one could sleep. The walls whispered like paper rubbed together, carrying words too faint to comprehend. Doors opened and closed in distant parts of the inn, though no footsteps followed. One guest finally rose, compelled by a soft humming that led to the attic. The air thickened as they climbed, each step resonating like a heartbeat beneath their feet. The attic door hung ajar, and beyond it, candlelight flickered over shapes drawn in ash across the floor. At the room's center stood an antique phonograph spinning, though the needle was broken, the faint melody warped and looping endlessly. As the guest reached to stop it, the attic light failed, plunging the room into silence, except for one last whisper, spoken directly behind them. "You're not alone up here?" By dawn, the marsh had turned to glass. No birds called, no insects stirred. The guests gathered again, though none could explain why. They were compelled, as if a pulse beneath the inn summoned them. The host placed a blackened candle at the table's center and lit it with a trembling hand. "It listens now," he said softly, the words falling like ash. Around them, the air seemed to constrict. Their breaths rose in unison, visible though the fire burned nearby. One of them whispered a prayer, another reached to snuff the flame. But it burned higher, brighter, defiant. From the ceiling above came the faint creak of footsteps, slow, deliberate, matching the rhythm of their own racing hearts. Something unseen had joined them, its presence folding the air, its silence heavier than any voice. The candle's flame swayed as though pushed by invisible hands. Their reflections in the mirrors wavered, melting into smears of pale light. The host urged them to join hands, and reluctantly, they did. A low hum rose through the floorboards, a vibration rather than a sound, and with it came a sense of intrusion, of being observed from within. The walls began to groan. The table trembled, and a voice not belonging to any of them spoke from the center. "One among you has already crossed." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Then the candle went out. For a moment, nothing existed but the echo of the unseen words and the awareness that something had shifted, something irreversible. When light returned, one chair was empty. The host counted, then counted again, his voice cracking on the number 5. No one had moved, yet the 6th guest was gone. A single candle still burned at their place, the wax unmelted, the flame motionless. The host's composure faltered. His lips quivered as if trying to form a name he dared not speak. Somewhere behind the walls, a faint tapping began, rapid, insistent, like someone trying to escape. It traveled along the plaster, following the lines of the corridor. One of the remaining guests stood, drawn by it, and when their hand touched the wall, the tapping stopped. But the surface was warm, pulsing like skin. They recoiled, realizing too late that the inn was not a building at all, but a body beginning to awaken. They fled to the foyer, but the doors no longer opened to the outside. Beyond the glass, the marsh shimmered like black mercury, its fog replaced by an opaque, undulating mist. The host pounded on the wood until his hands bled. The sound did not echo, as if the air itself swallowed it. Then came laughter, not cruel, but knowing, from somewhere deep within the inn. It was the missing guest's voice, distant yet unmistakable. The group turned, realizing the sound came from the phonograph upstairs. The melody had changed, no longer looping but speaking. Each note seemed to pronounce their names. The air trembled, and one of the mirrors in the hall fractured, revealing beneath its silver backing a dark, shifting void that seemed to breathe. Night consumed the house entirely. The remaining guests gathered near the dying hearth, their faces drawn, their whispers frantic. One clutched a rosary, another a photograph of someone long gone. The host stared into the flames until they bent backward, revealing something beneath. The outline of the 6th guest burned into the glow like an afterimage refusing to fade. "They're not spirits," the host whispered finally. "They're echoes that remember being human." Outside, thunder rolled across the marsh, shaking the window panes. In the silence that followed, a hand pressed against the glass from the outside, pale, dripping, unmistakably human. And as they stared, the reflection of the room began to shift again, showing more people inside than there truly were. The storm raged through the night, but by morning, the marsh was still again. Too still, as though holding its breath. The guests, hollow-eyed and sleepless, gathered at the window, watching the mist coil around the inn's edges like fingers testing a wound. The host's voice had changed. It carried the tremor of someone who'd seen too much. He insisted they go to the cellar, claiming the answers lay beneath, where the walls met the marsh. They followed him, despite the dread that swelled with every step. The descent was long, the air damp and heavy with decay. Water dripped from the beams in slow, rhythmic patterns. At the base of the stairs, the floor was covered in shallow, murky water that rippled, though there was no movement. Then came the sound, a faint echo of their own voices whispering from below the surface. They spread out through the cellar, guided by the dim sweep of their lights. The walls here were older, carved from stone, veined with something black and pulsing faintly, as if the building itself had arteries. The host knelt near a rusted drain where whispers converged, murmuring like water rushing backward. "It began here," he said, voice breaking. "The seances, the recordings, they never stopped." The sound beneath the grate grew louder, almost pleading. Then, without warning, the water rippled outward, and the reflection of one guest rose from the surface, eyes open, mouth moving. But the real person stood frozen, watching themselves speak from below. The reflection's voice was soft, distant, and wrong. "Help me remember who I am." The real one screamed. The reflections began to multiply. Each guest saw themselves emerging from the water, whispering fragments of memory that were not their own. Moments of strangers, deaths, fears, confessions. The air grew colder with each echo, their breath visible in sharp bursts. The host tried to chant something, a prayer, perhaps, but his words only seemed to strengthen the voices. The reflections began to grin, and when one reached out, the surface of the water broke, not like liquid, but like skin tearing. Panic erupted. Candles fell, flames hissed out. In the strobe of lightning through the cracked ceiling, faces alternated, living and reflected, real and unreal, until it became impossible to tell which side of the water was the true world. When the water finally stilled, 2 guests were missing. The others stumbled back toward the stairs, but the doorway had vanished. Only the damp stone wall remained, slick and breathing. A low moan filled the space, deep and resonant, vibrating through their bones. The host turned slowly, his face lit from below by the faint phosphorescence in the water. "They're not gone," he said, "just remembered differently." As he spoke, his reflection began to move on its own, lagging behind his gestures, then catching up too quickly, like time folding. The reflection smiled when he did not. Then, with terrible calm, it stepped forward out of the water entirely and stood behind him, perfectly solid, perfectly silent. The reflected host spoke first, its voice a pitch lower, echoing slightly as though 2 tones overlapped. "The inn remembers all who enter," it said. The real host staggered back, hands trembling. The others froze, their gazes darting between the 2. The reflection's eyes were hollow yet alive, brimming with movement, like water seen too closely. Then it raised its hand and the water behind it rose too, defying gravity, curling upward in sheets of silver. The room darkened. The air became dense, every breath heavy with salt and rot. "You wanted proof," the reflection whispered, stepping closer. "Now you belong to the proof." The water fell in a single crash, swallowing light, breath, and sound, until only the echoes of their screams remained. When they awoke, there was no sense of having slept. The cellar was gone. In its place stretched an unfamiliar corridor, lined with doors that pulsed faintly, like the beating of a heart muffled behind walls. The survivors, those who could still remember their names, walked cautiously, their footsteps absorbed by the air. Every door whispered as they passed, syllables that almost formed words. The host's reflection was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered in the trembling of light bulbs overhead. They opened one door, expecting escape, but found only another version of the inn beyond it. Familiar furniture rearranged, colors faded, a memory of itself. And in the center of that mirrored room sat the phonograph, turning slowly, though the needle hovered above the vinyl, drawing sound from silence. They entered the mirrored room, and the air shifted, dense with static. The phonograph began to play a voice they recognized but could not name. each word reversed, syllables drowning within themselves. One guest clutched their ears, another fell to their knees as photographs from the walls fluttered down like autumn leaves. Each photo showed them sitting in this very room, decades older, eyes hollow. The host approached the phonograph, hand trembling. "It's recording," he whispered. The realization settled like dust. The machine wasn't replaying the past but capturing the present, folding their voices into the loop that had never ended. Then, faintly from the record's hiss, another voice emerged, speaking their future in broken gasps. "You stay until someone else listens." The walls began to hum again, not from sound but from vibration. Low, persistent, resonating through bone. Mirrors along the walls clouded, revealing shifting shadows that mimicked their movements a fraction too late. One guest pressed their hand to the glass, only for their reflection to press back harder, forcing cracks that spidered outward. From behind the fractured surface, a face leaned forward, not their own, but watching intently. The reflection whispered without moving its lips, "We are what you left behind." The mirror splintered, and a fine dust, like ground bone, fell into the air. The humming deepened, shaking the floor, and every reflection in the room turned its head toward the door at once. Something was coming down the corridor, dragging the silence with it. The door creaked open, revealing the marsh where the corridor should have been. Mist poured in, thick and luminous, carrying the scent of stagnant water and something older. The inn's floorboards tilted, merging seamlessly with the mud outside. The survivors hesitated at the threshold, unsure if they were stepping out or further in. The host led them through the fog, calling out names that dissolved into echoes. The silhouettes of drowned trees emerged ahead, their branches weighted with hanging shapes that swayed gently. As they neared, the fog parted just enough to reveal that the shapes were portraits, suspended in glass frames, faces within shifting as though filmed underwater. Some were their own, others unfamiliar. Perhaps those who had come before, still waiting to be remembered. They reached the heart of the marsh, where water met sky in a seamless gray expanse. The host stopped, staring at his reflection on the surface. This time, it did not mimic him. It smiled first. Ripples spread outward, and the water began to clear, revealing beneath its surface countless silhouettes standing upright, their eyes open, their mouths forming silent words. The air grew impossibly cold, and the last candle's flame extinguished with a hiss. "It remembers us all," the host whispered, voice breaking into a sob. Even those who tried to forget. One by one, the reflections reached upward, their hands breaching the water's skin. The survivors screamed, but no sound escaped. The marsh had inherited everything they'd ever been, and it was not done remembering. The storm that followed had no thunder, only light, flashes of pale illumination that seemed to come from beneath the marsh instead of the sky. The survivors stumbled back toward what remained of the inn, though it now appeared translucent, its walls breathing with a slow, tidal rhythm. Inside, furniture floated weightlessly in the air, revolving as if caught in an unseen current. The host's voice was faint, hollowed of humanity. "We are inside its memory," he whispered, touching the wall as though it were flesh. The others watched in horror as his reflection began to move behind him once more, mimicking not his body, but his fear. The reflection opened its mouth, and a low gurgling began, a sound of drowning that filled the room until everything pulsed with it. The light shifted, and suddenly there were two inns, one layered over the other, one solid, one translucent, overlapping like film reels, misaligned. Every movement left a trail, a double image that lagged before snapping into place. The guests tried to run, but the hallways bent upon themselves, returning them to the same parlor again and again. The host had begun to dissolve, his outline flickering, his skin reflecting the room as though made of polished glass. "It wants us to see what it sees," he said, his words echoing twice. One of the guests reached toward him, and their hand passed straight through, rippling the space like water. "It's remembering us wrong," she whispered, before her own reflection stepped forward, lips moving to finish her sentence for her. The mirrored version of the inn began to win. The reflections moved faster, steadier, while the living grew faint, their voices hollowing into static. The walls turned liquid, absorbing sound and light. The host fell to his knees, clutching his head as whispers cascaded in a dozen versions of his own tone. "It's rewriting us," he gasped. Then from the ceiling, water began to fall. Not rain, but fragments of reflection. Droplets that shimmered like mirrors breaking midair. Where they landed, reality blurred. Faces warped, furniture bent in impossible directions. One guest tried to flee, but the floor gave way, revealing beneath it an endless expanse of faces staring upward, each belonging to someone they once were, each waiting to be remembered again. Only two remained now, their bodies pale from cold and reflection. They moved through corridors of shifting glass, every step echoing with whispers of lives that might have been theirs. The host was gone, absorbed or transcended. It was impossible to tell. The surviving woman carried a lantern that dimmed with every breath, while the man beside her muttered fragments of prayer. "If it sees us, we're remembered," she said. "If it remembers, we stay." The lantern flickered, and in that brief pulse of darkness they glimpsed dozens of versions of themselves walking parallel paths, each frozen in a different moment of terror. When the light steadied, the others were gone, but faint impressions remained, burned into the walls like afterimages of the living. At the inn's center they found what might once have been a chapel, a space filled with standing mirrors arranged like an audience. Each reflected a scene from the past arrivals, laughter, the first seance, the first disappearance. In the largest mirror stood the missing host, smiling faintly, beckoning them closer. "Join the memory," he said from within. The woman reached out and her hand passed through, her reflection gripping it tightly from the other side. The man tried to pull her back, but his reflection did the same, until glass and flesh were indistinguishable. The mirrors trembled, their surfaces softening like breath on frost. Then, one by one, they cracked, releasing a rush of cold air, and a chorus of distant voices whispering the same word, "Stay." When the mirrors shattered, there was no noise, only vibration, rippling outward through the inn's hollow bones. The survivors awoke, lying on the marsh floor beneath a colorless dawn. The inn stood nearby, translucent now, its form wavering like heat above still water. The woman tried to speak but found no voice. Her words drifted from her lips as threads of mist, curling upward and vanishing. The man pressed his hands to his ears, realizing there were no sounds left. Not wind, not breath, not heartbeat. Yet within the silence came a pressure, a pulse, a rhythm too deliberate to be imagined. It was the inn calling them back, its resonance shaping the air into imitation voices, the ghosts of words it had once devoured. The silence grew dense, tactile. When they moved, the air resisted as though underwater. The woman reached for the man's arm, and their movements left streaks of light behind them, lingering after contact. Shapes began forming in the mist, people made of outlines, their bodies flickering like candle smoke. Each one opened its mouth in perfect unison, and the marsh answered with sound for the first time, a long, low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The man recognized it. It was the phonograph's note, stretched and eternal. The sound shaped the fog into faces, hundreds of them, whispering their names in a language both foreign and intimately known. The woman began to cry, but her tears turned to steam before they touched her skin. They followed the hum toward the ruins of the inn. Its door stood open, revealing a single corridor that stretched infinitely. The walls glowed with faint inscriptions. Names, dates, voices made visible in lines of wavering gold. Each step they took echoed softly, not from the floor, but from inside their own chests. The man paused at a doorway marked with his name. Through it, He saw himself sitting at a table years before, listening to static on a radio. "This is where you began," said the voice behind him. It was the woman's, though she had not spoken. Her lips did not move. The sound came from her shadow instead. When she looked down, she saw her shadow whispering back, urging her to listen. They reached the great hall where the seance had once begun. The furniture floated now in perfect silence, frozen mid-motion as though time itself had stalled. In the room's center, the black candle still burned, its flame suspended, neither consuming nor fading. The man stepped closer, drawn to it. If we extinguish it, he thought, we end this. Yet as he approached, the light dimmed, and from its shadow emerged the reflection of the host, head tilted, smiling gently. "Endings are just silences pretending to be mercy," it whispered. The woman lunged forward, seizing the candle, but its wax turned to water in her grip, searing cold. The flame did not die. It multiplied, one for each of their reflections now flickering around the room. The flames filled the hall until every surface burned without heat. Shadows thickened, swallowing the last traces of their humanity. The man turned toward the woman, but she had already begun to fade, her outline breaking into light fragments, scattering upward like moths. "Listen." Her voice echoed inside his head. "Listen or forget." He closed his eyes, and the silence pressed closer, shaping itself around him. When he opened them, he stood once more before the marsh, but it no longer reflected him. Instead, it mirrored the inn's facade perfectly. Windows flickering, doors breathing. Endless rooms filled with faint murmurs. Then came the sound again. The phonograph's final loop, playing the same two words forever we remember. The marsh no longer breathed. It had become a mirror without depth, an expanse of silver skin stretching to the horizon. The man stood upon its edge, uncertain whether he was standing above water or within it. The inn shimmered in the reflection, whole again, alive, untouched by decay. Yet when he turned, nothing stood behind him but endless mist. Voices began to murmur from beneath the surface, speaking not to him but through him, threading syllables into his breath. "Memory does not die," they whispered. "It becomes whoever listens." He gazed downward, and his reflection smiled, a soft, knowing smile that wasn't his own. He understood then that the inn had never wanted worship or fear. It wanted witnesses, so it could continue to exist. The man stepped forward, his foot breaking the mirror surface without resistance. The world beneath was not water, but air reversed. Upside down, suffused with amber light, he descended slowly, finding himself in a version of the inn where every detail pulsed faintly, as if alive. The walls whispered his thoughts before he could think them. The phonograph spun in the corner, its record blank, its needle writing light instead of sound. From the far side of the room, the reflection of the woman approached, her form transparent but smiling. "You came back," she said, though no voice carried. Her words rippled through the air like distant thunder. "Now it remembers perfectly." She reached out her hand, and the light bent toward her fingers as though it longed to be touched. Together they moved through the mirrored halls, now weightless, each step leaving behind trails of light that pulsed like veins. The room showed no objects, only impressions of what had been, echoes suspended midair, a chair, a flame, a whisper. The woman paused before a door that shimmered with movement. "This is where they keep us," she murmured, though her lips did not move. The man reached for the handle, and warmth pulsed through his palm. Inside, the room was vast and endless, its floor covered in shallow, glassy water. Beneath it lay countless faces, shifting and breathing as one. Each time the water rippled, the faces rearranged, becoming those of strangers, then of themselves, then of no one at all. He knelt beside the water and whispered the woman's name. though he wasn't sure it was truly hers. Her reflection knelt beside his, yet its movement lagged behind, slower, softer. An echo of tenderness caught in eternity. "If we remember them," he said, "maybe we can let them rest." The reflection of the host appeared across the water, faint and distant. "You misunderstand," it replied gently. "Nothing here wants rest. Memory is the only thing that survives." The light began to flicker, each pulse illuminating another layer of faces below. Generations upon generations, all waiting to be noticed. The woman's reflection looked up at him with hollow eyes and smiled, whispering a single word that rippled the water into silence. "Stay." The water rose, silent and patient, lifting them until reflection and reality merged completely. The inn dissolved around them, its walls unspooling into threads of light that curved upward into the mist. The man tried to breathe, but air had become memory, heavy and sweet. He saw his own reflection drift free, taking his place, smiling with calm acceptance. The woman's hand found his, fingers cold yet steady. Above, the marsh shimmered one final time, its surface unbroken, serene. Within it, countless faces blinked in perfect harmony, their eyes open but unseeing. Somewhere in the depthless silence, a phonograph turned once more, and from it came a whisper, soft as breath, carrying the story's last truth: you were always here.